When is war morally justified? In a recent lecture, I talked about Richard Nixon's approach to foreign policy, and I called him a realist. And the realists are the ones who focus on the balance of power. Who's got the power? How do you use power? The realists, perhaps as the name implies, don't spend a whole lot of time trying to find out when war is justified. They say, well, power does what power does. And if a country has power, it's going to act with that power. If it has a big army, it's going to use that army. I think I even cited the quote from Joseph Stalin in response to an objection by Winston Churchill that the Pope in Rome wouldn't approve of a particular aspect of policy that touched on Italy. And Stalin sneeringly said, and how many divisions, referring to military divisions, how many divisions does the Pope have? So that's sort of the attitude of realists toward war. War is this thing that happens, and good or bad, it just happens, so deal with it. But a lot of other people, including very many Americans, like to believe that when the United States, well, focus on Americans, when the United States goes to war, it does so for good, justifiable reasons. And the question then arises, so what constitutes a justifiable reason for war? This question of war, what constitutes a just war, is something that had been debated within the Christian world for centuries before the United States came along. Whether 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, people debated what constituted a just war was, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they were all realists back in those days. But I wouldn't be surprised if when the armies of the Egyptian pharaoh went into the field, the pharaoh, or at least somebody, or maybe the families of those who volunteered to fight or were compelled to fight, they talked about this is a good cause and why we must do it. So, but once you get into a democracy, once you get into a situation where the people actually can make political decisions, and if they don't like the decisions made by officials, by the elected officials in their name, they can kick them out of office. Well, okay, then governments, for understandable reasons, spend more time trying to figure out how to make wars appear just. So this is something that Americans have labored with, but I say Americans by no means alone. So what are the legitimate causes for war? What are the legitimate ones? The ones that morally justify war? Well, typically these begin with defense of the homeland. So if your country has been attacked, then the use of force is justified. Now, I'm going to rule out here people who are philosophical pacifists, who reject categorically the use of force, whether in response to force or anything else. So if you're a pacifist, then you wouldn't necessarily agree with this. But I should say, if you're a pacifist, you shouldn't be president of the United States or ruler of any, or leader of any other great country. Because there are plenty of people out in the world who aren't pacifists. There are bad characters out there. And if they know that you will not respond to violence with violence, you risk giving them license to commit more violence. Anyway, so if your country is attacked, then that basically ends all debate. And we see this in American history. When the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, then the debate over isolationism or interventionism went away. The isolationists lost. The United States is in the war. There's nothing more to debate. We can postpone the debate if there's going to be any more until after the war is over. And this is something that causes the leaders, especially of elected governments, democracies and other kinds of elected governments, to maneuver themselves into a position where the other side fires the first shot, or at least a case can be made that there is this impending threat to the country. So when Israel went to war against Egypt in 1967, the Israelis shot first, but they had good grounds for arguing that the Egyptians were about to shoot. And so this seemed justified, especially in view of the fact that Israel is a small country surrounded by hostile neighbors with almost no room to retreat. Israel, especially before the Six-Day War of 1967, was so thin that Arab armies could just march all the way across the country and divide the country in two within just a few hours. So, to respond preemptively when a war is about to be declared against you, when a raid is about to be launched, that usually has fallen in the category of just wars. This is a just cause for war. So if somebody pulls a gun on you, making this relatable to individuals, if somebody pulls a gun on you, you don't have to let them fire first before you can defend yourself. So it's like that. If the gun is loaded and pointed at you, then you can shoot the person who is about to shoot you. And that's in the field. It's called a preemptive war. So you preempt something that's about to happen. But how about something that's not about to happen immediately, but might happen somewhere down the road? Well, this falls in the category of something called preventive war. It seems to be hair-splitting a little bit, and I admit it is, but sometimes in these moral arguments you do split hairs because the questions are pretty fine and closely connected. So, a preventive war. In the late 1940s, between 1945, when the US acquired the atom bomb, and 1949, when the Soviet Union acquired the atom bomb, there were some in the United States who proposed that the United States should wage a preventive war against the Soviet Union to prevent the Soviet Union from acquiring atomic weapons. And the argument was that this is a bad regime we're dealing with in the Soviet Union. If they get the bomb, then we're going to be at risk. If they had gotten the bomb first, they would have used it against us, so the argument went. Therefore, we're justified in using the bomb against them before they get it. This was the argument that was made in some circles in the United States in the late 1940s. Harry Truman, the President of the United States, did not accept the arguments and did not launch a preventive war against the Soviet Union. But the question came up again after 9/11, because 9/11 seemed to be a different kind of thing. In the case of the Soviet Union, especially once the two sides had nuclear weapons, there was a belief that the Soviet Union could be deterred from attacking the United States, because the Soviet Union was this ongoing concern, and the government officials in Moscow, presumably they cared about their lives, and they didn't want to lose their lives, and so if they launched an attack on the United States, they would know that they might be killed an hour later when the American bombs flattened the Kremlin. And so that would impose this rationality. It would impose a sense of limitation on the Soviet leadership. But what do you do if you're dealing with people who are willing to give their lives for their cause? What do you do with people who are bent on suicide anyway? The Al-Qaeda operatives who flew the planes into the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, they were suicide pilots. They were kamikazes. They were bombers who were going to blow themselves up in doing it. And presumably, these people are much harder to deter. The standard interpretation of these kinds of acts is that they have a view of their religion that says if they die in an attack on the enemy of the religion, the infidels, the foes of Islam, then they will immediately go to heaven. They will go to paradise. And so they become martyrs. And martyrs have usually been honored in most religious traditions. Certainly Christians honored their martyrs. Now, their martyrs were not generally, or almost never, suicide bomber types. I mean, they weren't killing other people. In fact, in the Christian tradition, when you kill other people, you don't count as a martyr. But apparently, the terrorists of Al-Qaeda and others who operated in the same kind of cultural perspective and religious perspective, they considered an attack on the enemy. Well, I should say, so in wartime, somebody in a declared war, where if somebody in World War I goes over the top of the trenches and comes out blazing and kills a bunch of the enemy, knowing that this person is going to get killed, Okay, well then that person, it's sometimes, I mean, not often called a martyr exactly, but still that person is a great hero. So the Al-Qaeda fighters were heroes in the eyes of the supporters of Osama bin Laden's movement. And so if they're willing to give their lives, then presumably they're much harder to deter. Because how do you stop somebody who expects to die anyway, and in dying, goes straight to heaven? So this made it a different problem, perhaps a harder problem, than deterring Soviet use of nuclear weapons, Soviet aggression during the Cold War. Because the Soviets, at least in official terms, they were atheists and they didn't have a paradise to go to. But generally speaking, it was thought that when you're dealing with another country, countries have kind of a sense of responsibility or an attachment to the status quo in a way that lone individuals, especially ones who are motivated by religious zealotry, do not. So it was a harder problem, and 9/11 demonstrated this. And furthermore, now we are in this age of asymmetrical warfare, where just a handful of individuals, a relative handful of individuals, could inflict this terrible damage on American society, kill thousands of Americans. So President George W. Bush is in a situation where he's got to figure out what to do about this. Does he change American policy? American policy before 9/11 never officially embraced preventive war. And I gave the example where Harry Truman explicitly refused to okay the idea of a preventive war against the Soviet Union. But the case was made to George W. Bush that the U.S. needed to change policy. And Bush was persuaded. And the argument went basically like this. The United States, as badly as it suffered, as tragically as it suffered in 9/11, was lucky. Because the terrorists of 9/11, all they had were airplanes. And the only munitions on the airplanes were the jet fuel, which did enough damage to destroy the World Trade Center from the Pentagon and kill thousands of people. But suppose those terrorists had got their hands on nuclear weapons. And suppose instead of blowing up the World Trade Center, they had detonated an atom bomb over Manhattan. Think of all the death and destruction that would occur then. And this was something that American officials needed to think seriously about. And they did. And the thinking became, okay, as bad as 9/11 was, the next time it might be worse. Because the next, and you know that the terrorists, they're not put off, they're not deterred from their objective by American actions. If anything, they're going to sort of double down and they're going to try to get bigger weapons next time. The concern of the Bush administration, having embraced the idea, in fact, so in 2002, the year after 9/11, the Bush administration, George W. Bush's administration, formally adopts a policy that includes preventive war. And again, the thinking was, in this age of terrorism, sometimes the United States must strike before the terrorists get the weapon, because once the weapon is in their hands, it's too late. So, in part because they're going to do it on the sly, they're not going to form up regular armies, they're going to work behind the scenes, and they're going to keep out of sight as much as possible. So, this was a policy that was formally adopted by the Bush administration in 2002. And it was to apply, especially to the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And this is where the argument gets a little bit wobbly. Well, more than a little bit wobbly, a lot wobbly. Saddam Hussein was not a supporter of Al-Qaeda. Saddam Hussein was not a terrorist. Saddam Hussein, in fact, was the leader of a country, and in that regard was more in the same position as, say, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, than of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden seemed to be reasonably happy with the idea of dying for his cause. But Joseph Stalin didn't want to die for his cause, and Saddam Hussein presumably didn't want to die for his cause either. So he was no friend of the terrorists. In fact, there was bad blood between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. Nonetheless, it served the Bush administration's purposes to kind of muddy up that distance between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, because the Bush administration had its own reasons and separate reasons for wanting to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Some of it came from the fact that Saddam Hussein had been a pain in the neck of the United States and the West in the Middle East ever since since before the Gulf War of 1991. And as I mentioned earlier, it had been the hope of the elder George Bush that Saddam Hussein would be overthrown by the Iraqi people, and then a new government would come in friendlier to the United States. That didn't happen. Saddam Hussein tightened the screws even more tightly on Iraq. And he was just a bad actor in Iraqi politics. He was brutal to his people at times, but they couldn't seem to get rid of him. So the Bush administration had an agenda to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The fact that Saddam Hussein was implicated in an apparent assassination attempt against George Bush's father, the younger George Bush's father, sort of added a personal element to this. So W. Bush, as he's often called, or sometimes 43 in the family, the 43rd president as opposed to 41, the 41st president, his father, decided he was going to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And the war on terrorism provided the cover to do this. It provided the rationale. And the connecting link was so-called weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. So the weapons of mass destruction were, first of all, nuclear weapons. And the argument was, what if the terrorists get their hands on nuclear weapons? Well, where will they get nuclear weapons? Well, maybe from a regime in the Middle East that is developing nuclear weapons, for example, on the sly, or in violation of international protocols or international program. So, what if, for example, Saddam Hussein developed nuclear weapons and gave the nuclear weapons to the terrorists? Now, there were two kind of stretchy parts of this argument. What if Saddam Hussein got nuclear weapons? There was no indication that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. There was some indication that Saddam Hussein maybe wanted nuclear weapons or at some point had been working on nuclear weapons. But the evidence was unclear because there's a fine line that separates work toward nuclear weapons from work toward nuclear power generating electric plants. And the electric power plants are quite legal and lots of countries have them. And so if a government like the government of the United States wanted to interpret actions of Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government that were really aimed at developing nuclear power for electrical generation as leading to a nuclear weapons system, it was sort of able to do so, and it could do with some plausibility. So WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, included nuclear weapons. That was the biggest concern. But there were also chemical weapons, things like gas, various poison gases that had been used on populations, and bacteriological weapons, so weapons of disease, so spreading anthrax spores or something like this, something that would cause devastation to populations. And the thing that characterized these WMDs, this sort of trinity of WMDs, is that they were for use against populations. So these weren't anti-military weapons. These were weapons that were going to kill people indiscriminately. You blow up a nuclear bomb, even if you just spread nuclear radioactive stuff that has been spread by a conventional bomb, then all sorts of people, civilians and everybody, men, women, children, old people, they die. And it's not just like bullets targeted at soldiers. And the same is true of chemical weapons and biological or bacteriological weapons. So these WMDs seem to be particularly nasty things, and a plausible case, or it seemed plausible to a lot of people, a plausible case that Saddam Hussein was developing maybe nuclear weapons, maybe chemical weapons, maybe biological weapons, was made by the Bush administration. It was made with some sincerity to the argument that, boy, we sure hope these don't get in the hands of terrorists, even if Saddam Hussein won't use them. And because the counter-argument to this was Saddam Hussein's not going to use these because if he does, then he knows that the United States will destroy his regime, flatten Baghdad, and take over the country. So Saddam Hussein as Saddam Hussein could be deterred the way the Soviet Union was deterred. This was the thinking. But if the terrorists get their hands on them, then they can't be deterred. They want to die and go to heaven as martyrs anyway. So this was the argument that was made. And the argument was made to the United Nations by the Bush administration and to the world. And the Bush administration put together basically this campaign, this brief against Saddam Hussein, a diplomatic and political campaign, arguing that evidence shows that Saddam Hussein is nearly acquiring nuclear weapons and maybe chemical weapons, and who knows, biological weapons too, perhaps. And the United Nations needs to do something about it. And the thinking was, this is going to be like 1991. when the United Nations voted in favor of war against this very same regime, Saddam Hussein. Except this time around, the United Nations did not go along with the American administration. Russia was opposed to the idea. As I said, Russia, the Soviet Union had that moment at the end of the Cold War where it was willing to ally with the United States, but no longer. And France was very skeptical of this. The French thought that the Americans were cooking up something that didn't exist at all. And they pointed out that Saddam Hussein was no friend of the terrorists. And so there was no reason to believe that Saddam Hussein would give these weapons of mass destruction, even if he had them, to the terrorists. And furthermore, there wasn't strong evidence that Saddam Hussein had them or was about to get them. Nonetheless, the Bush administration continued with its campaign and said, all right, well, if the UN won't go along with us, we'll go by ourselves, except not really by ourselves. We'll go along with other countries that are willing to go with us. And so the Bush administration talked Britain and several other countries into joining the United States in this campaign against Saddam Hussein. And when Saddam Hussein refused to open up all of his country to inspections by people to demonstrate, experts who could demonstrate whether or not there was the evidence of weapons of mass destruction, then President Bush gave the order to invade Iraq. And in the thinking probably of George W. Bush, and in the thinking of a lot of observers, this was pretty clearly a case of sort of finishing the unfinished business left over from his father's administration. We're finally going to take out Saddam Hussein. And this time, instead of hesitating before going into Baghdad, the United States and military forces, they go straight to Baghdad and they drive Saddam Hussein from power. And so it looks as though we did what we wanted to do. The trouble was, and things always get more complicated. They seem easy when viewed from a distance. They seem easy viewed from before the war starts. But once the war starts, things get more complicated. And this was a complication that anybody should have seen coming. And that is, okay, you can overthrow Saddam Hussein, but who are you going to replace him with? There were people who were they'd raise their hand and say, okay, I'll be prime minister, I'll be president of Iraq. But how much support do they have? In the United States, once its military is in control of Baghdad, the capital, they can basically say, well, it's you or you or you or you. At which point, the United States becomes responsible for what this new government does. Furthermore, there is that nationalist backlash. There were a lot of people in Iraq who weren't particularly unfavorably disposed toward the United States before American troops get into Iraq. But once American troops arrive, and troops do what troops do, namely, in fact, as generals often put it, what armies do is they break things and kill people. And once you've broken a lot of things and killed a lot of people, including a lot of sort of innocent Iraqi bystanders, then you become really unpopular. And so there was this sort of nationalist, patriotic backlash against the Americans. There was another problem about dealing with Iraq and a successor regime to Saddam Hussein. Saddam ruled Iraq with an iron hand. He was, in some respects, Iraq's version of, I had mentioned, Yugoslavia under Tito, where there had been this whole bunch of different groups that could be held together only by somebody with a really strong and iron hand, an iron fist. And once Tito was off the scene, then Yugoslavia exploded. Well, much the same thing was true regarding Iraq. Once Saddam Hussein was chased out of power, and I say he was chased out of power, he was on the run for many months after American troops got into Baghdad. And it took many months to track him down and find him. He was finally captured by American soldiers. And then he was handed over to Iraqi officials, that is, the officials of the new post-Saddam Iraqi regime. And he was tried and he was executed. And so that's the end of Saddam Hussein. But it wasn't the end of American troubles in Iraq, because once Saddam is out of power, then the various factions, the different groups living in Iraq, began to pull apart. And they each wanted their share of the land, they wanted their share of political power. And there has been a fundamental historical split among different groups of Muslims. And these are between the Shias or the Shiites, that's one version, and the Sunnis. And these two groups lived within Iraq. And they're scattered over the rest of the Muslim world. But within Iraq, these two groups had been living at more or less peace while Saddam Hussein was in charge, in large part because he refused to let them mess with each other very much. Well, Saddam's gone, and they begin sort of messing with each other, in part at the instigation of Iran. Iran's version of Islam is mostly Shia. And so they support the Shias in Iraq. And so there's this sort of half of Iraq, it's a third, maybe a third of Iraq, that moves into the Shia camp. There's another third, roughly, that's in the Sunni camp. And then there's another part of Iraq that consists of Kurds. These are a different group of people ethnically and linguistically who occupy a territory that overlaps Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And for years they had wanted a country of their own. And in fact, the United States had given them encouragement at the time of the first Gulf War, in 1991, and that, okay, the United States looked favorably upon them getting their own country. It didn't happen, but they still liked the idea of having their own country. So Iraq began to split into these different parts. And in the case of Iraq, as contrasted with Yugoslavia, there was a lot of concern as who was going to get the oil fields. Because if you had oil, then you had money, and money can buy weapons, and you can do all this other stuff. And meanwhile, the Shias, as I said, are getting support from Iran. And so you get these outside forces in Iraq. And this caused Americans to think about this ideal of democracy. Americans, I've said various times, Americans like to think that democracy is what the world is working toward. And in fact, the Bush administration, when it went into Iraq, for the purposes of finding the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was putting together and didn't find any WMDs, then they went to their fallback explanation as to why American troops are in Iraq, and that was namely to help the Iraqis toward democracy. Democracy was this good thing, and it would benefit the Iraqi people just as it benefited the American people. Well, as I've said previously, democracy emerged in the United States over a long period of time. And if you add in the European background, it took centuries for the idea of democracy to take hold. And to think that the Iraqi people were thirsting for democracy before the American troops arrived was to engage in willful self-deception. In fact, if anything, the experience of Saddam Hussein kind of demonstrated that democracy wouldn't work in Iraq, because there were these groups that didn't think of themselves first as Iraqis, but as Sunnis or Shias or Kurds. And so it maybe took somebody like Saddam Hussein to hold the place together. In fact, what happened in Iraq was something that verged in the direction of what happened in the United States in the 1860s, where half the country, the South, said, you know, we don't want to be part of this anymore. We're going to create our own country. Well, it never got quite that far, because the United States, with its troops there, never let it happen. But what it meant was that the war in Iraq looked like it was never going to end. And with the war in Afghanistan going on as well, the United States is trying to figure out, how do we get out of this? The Bush administration authorized an increase in troop numbers to suppress the various insurgencies, but that lasted only so long. And by the time Barack Obama became president, the United States had decided, the American people decided, you know, this is a war we got to get out of. And Barack Obama inherited 2 wars from George W. Bush. And he decided he hoped he could end both of them, but he decided, okay, I'll end one of them. And the United States basically came up with this deal where, okay, we're going to give aid to the Iraqi government, but we're out of here. And midway through Barack Obama's first term as president, the United States pulled out of Iraq. The United States continues to support Iraq with money and with other means of support. But American troops are no longer fighting in Iraq. Is Iraq closer to stability? Is Iraq closer to democracy? Is Iraq better off than it was under Saddam Hussein? Probably better off than under Saddam Hussein, but closer to democracy, that's a tough one to say. And what did the United States get out of its campaign, its war in Iraq? got a bunch of casualties, low thousands. It got a big debt. And was Iraq any more stable? That was a tough question to answer in the affirmative.